Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you introduced 42 bills in 7 years. So how many of them became law? And you do not need an exact figure because even an estimate will do. What followed was not a clever rebuttal, not a practiced pivot, not one of the polished clapbacks that had built an audience of millions, but 9 seconds of silence in front of roughly 8 million people watching live. The most recognizable congresswoman in America, a political celebrity with 9.6 million Instagram followers, magazine covers, viral clips, and a response prepared for almost every imaginable attack, could not bring herself to say one number. That number was not the number of scandals, followers, headlines, interviews, protests, or television appearances, because in every one of those categories, the answer would have been substantial. The number was zero. 0 laws after 7 years, 42 bills introduced, more than $1 million collected in congressional salary, and not one sponsored bill signed into law. Mike Johnson did not begin with private jets, expensive events, social media controversies, or any of the subjects AOC had spent years learning how to turn into counterattacks. He did something far more damaging because he opened a public scorecard pulled from GovTrack, the Congressional Record, and the clerk's office, and started reading the numbers exactly as they appeared. There was no need to raise his voice, invent a scandal, question her motives, or reach for the kind of partisan insult that would have allowed her to shift the argument from performance to persecution. He simply placed the record on the table and let the record speak, and the record kept returning to the same destination no matter how much fame surrounded it. 0 does not require interpretation. 0 does not improve when surrounded by better branding, and 0 does not become less visible because the person attached to it happens to be one of the most effective political communicators in the country. By the 8th minute of the hearing, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was operating exactly the way she had operated for years, turning a committee room into a stage and a congressional proceeding into a piece of political content designed to travel far beyond the chamber. She had already delivered her opening with a familiar rhythm that made her speeches instantly recognizable, leaning into the microphone, controlling the pace, shifting her voice at the right moments, and building each line toward a reaction. Medicaid cuts, housing, her mother cleaning offices, the Bronx, working families, and a Republican budget described as a blueprint for cruelty all arrived in the sequence that had repeatedly produced applause, headlines, and viral clips. Before the remarks were even finished, the machinery surrounding them was already doing what it had been built to do, slicing the strongest line into content and pushing it into the national political bloodstream. The performance was effective, the timing was precise, and the entire system worked beautifully, except for the inconvenient fact that communication and legislation are not the same job. Johnson sat at the head of the table with a 3-ring binder, an object so ordinary that it almost looked ridiculous beside the political spectacle unfolding around it. There was nothing cinematic about the binder, nothing designed for a campaign advertisement, nothing that suggested a dramatic ambush because its only purpose was to hold pages printed from public records. He waited until AOC finished, thanked her for an effective opening, and even acknowledged what everyone already knew, that she was one of the most gifted communicators in Congress and perhaps one of the most effective of her generation. Then he separated the talent from the job, making the distinction that her entire political brand had spent years blurring, because the ability to dominate attention does not automatically prove the ability to produce law. When he opened the binder and said that communication and legislation were not the same thing, the hearing stopped being about who could command the room and became a review of what had actually been accomplished inside it. The shift was immediate because AOC's team had prepared for attacks, not an audit. They had counter-arguments ready for the Green New Deal, defund the police, the Met Gala, travel, protests, and every controversy that had already been fought across cable television and social media 100 times. What they had not prepared for was a compliment followed by documentation, because outrage can be redirected and accusation can be reframed, but a public record has to be answered on its own terms. Johnson was not accusing her of being ineffective in some vague partisan sense. He was reading the numbers that Congress itself had produced and asking the most basic question a legislator can be asked. His method was almost embarrassingly simple, which was exactly why it was difficult to escape, because the more elaborate the response became, the more obvious the unanswered number remained. The binder showed 42 bills sponsored from the 116th through the 119th Congresses, 3 receiving committee votes, none passing the House, and none being signed into law. Johnson looked up and reduced 7 years of political visibility to a legislative result that fit inside a single word: 0. He then added the comparison that made the number harder to dismiss, noting that the average House member over the same period had managed to get laws enacted, and that the average New York representative had done the same at a still higher rate. AOC, according to the record Johnson was reading, stood in the bottom tier of the chamber for legislative effectiveness, below the overwhelming majority of her colleagues from both parties, and suddenly the discussion was no longer about whether she was famous, influential, feared, admired, hated, or constantly trending. Johnson then turned to Linda Park, a nail salon owner in Flushing, who had spent decades building a small business and paying tens of thousands of dollars in taxes. During the pandemic, according to the Scripps account, Linda had filed 23 federal forms in 3 weeks to secure a PPP loan and keep her business alive, a bureaucratic burden she carried because failure meant losing the shop she had spent years building. The comparison was deliberately brutal because it placed the ordinary pressure placed on a taxpayer beside the performance record of the official whose salary those taxpayers helped fund. Linda filed 23 forms in 3 weeks and kept her business alive, while the representative had spent 7 years in Congress without producing a law of her own. Johnson did not need to shout the conclusion because the contrast had already done the work. AOC responded with the defense available to any member of Congress whose legislative record is being separated from the rest of the job, pointing to constituent services, oversight, advocacy, and the power to raise public awareness. Those things are real, and Johnson did not deny that they mattered, but he refused to let them erase the category under examination. Legislation may not be the only measure of effectiveness, but it remains a measure, and for a person whose title is legislator, it is not an unreasonable one. The more AOC widened the definition of success, the more Johnson narrowed it back to the question sitting in the binder, because the hearing was not about whether she had influence, but whether that influence had produced laws. Once again, the answer waiting beneath every layer of explanation was the same. Johnson then moved through the public moments that had helped define AOC's national image, not to dispute that they had attracted attention, but to ask what legislative result followed them. The 2021 Met Gala appearance with the Tax the Rich dress became a national political moment, but the number of tax reform bills she introduced that became law remained 0. The 2022 arrest during an abortion rights protest generated photographs that traveled across every major network, but the number of bills she introduced to codify Roe that became law remained 0. The Green New Deal became one of the most recognizable political brands in the country, yet it remained a resolution rather than a law, and the later Fight Oligarchy tour generated enormous attention without changing the legislative column Johnson was reading. The pattern was not that AOC had done nothing, because clearly she had done a great deal, but that much of what she had done produced visibility while the measurable legislative result remained stubbornly empty. That was the distinction Johnson kept pressing, and it was far more dangerous than a conventional partisan attack because it did not deny her greatest strength. It acknowledged it, and then asked why that strength had failed to produce the result attached to the office. An influencer can move a conversation, build an audience, shape a narrative, raise money, dominate headlines, and become culturally important, but a member of Congress is also paid to legislate. The voters of New York's 14th District had not elected a content creator with a congressional office attached to the brand. They had elected a representative whose position existed inside a lawmaking institution. Johnson's argument was that 7 years of extraordinary communication could not be allowed to substitute permanently for legislative production, no matter how many people watched the speeches or shared the clips. And as the binder stayed open on the table, the confrontation was moving toward the question AOC could redirect only so many times before the silence itself became the answer. The next section of the record cut even deeper because it moved away from spectacle and into the dull machinery of Congress, the part of the job that almost never trends because committee attendance, bipartisan cooperation, procedural work, and legislative follow-through do not produce glamorous photographs. Johnson cited the record showing that Ocasio-Cortez joined bipartisan bills at one of the lowest rates among House Democrats, placing her below the overwhelming majority of her own party when it came to cross-aisle cooperation. He noted that she had co-sponsored fewer bipartisan measures than most Democratic members, and that her attendance at hearings on the very subjects she regularly claimed as priorities had fallen below her party's average. Financial services, oversight, housing, banking, consumer protection. These were not obscure assignments disconnected from her political identity, but committees dealing directly with issues she repeatedly presented as central to her public mission. The problem was no longer simply that the legislative column showed zero. The larger problem was that even the unglamorous institutional work surrounding that column did not support the image of relentless effectiveness that had been built through years of national attention. Johnson took off his glasses and returned to the point through the profession he understood best, teaching, because the analogy stripped the political vocabulary away and reduced the argument to a standard almost everyone could understand. He spoke about brilliant students, the ones who could dominate a room, debate anyone, speak with confidence, and convince everyone around them that their talent alone would carry them through. Some of those students, he explained, were so naturally gifted that they treated the boring work as beneath them. The worksheets, the problem sets, the daily assignments, the tasks nobody applauded because completing them was simply part of the job. The comparison was pointed without being complicated because Johnson was not arguing that AOC lacked intelligence or talent. He was arguing that talent without completed work is still incomplete performance. That distinction was devastating precisely because it denied her the easiest defense, the claim that the attack came from someone dismissing her abilities when Johnson was doing the opposite and using those abilities to make the lack of legislative output look even harder to excuse. He described her as one of the most talented communicators he had seen in Congress, then immediately explained why communication by itself could not be treated as the final product of a legislative career. A speech can move a room, dominate a news cycle, raise money, and shift public conversation, but unless it is connected to institutional action, the speech eventually leaves the room and the law remains exactly as it was before. Johnson's point was not that speeches were worthless, but that speeches become dangerously convenient when they are treated as substitutes for results rather than tools for achieving them. The applause, the clips, the interviews, the tours, the slogans, and the online following all created evidence of attention, but none of them changed the basic number inside the binder. 7 years had produced extraordinary visibility and extraordinary cultural reach, but the legislative outcome attached to the 42 sponsored bills remained zero. Then Johnson returned to Linda Park, because statistics are easy to dismiss until they are placed beside the ordinary obligations of someone who does not have a communications team available to explain away failure. Linda paid $38,000 a year in taxes, and some portion of that public money helped fund a congressional salary of $174,000 a year. Over 7 years, that salary totaled more than $1.2 million, and the contrast Johnson drew was intentionally unforgiving because Linda had been expected to complete 23 federal forms in 3 weeks simply to keep her business alive. She could not respond to the government by saying paperwork was only one measure of entrepreneurship, and she could not explain that advocacy, visibility, or public awareness should substitute for the documents required to save her shop. She had to complete the work placed in front of her, and Johnson's argument was that taxpayers were entitled to ask why the same standard of measurable output should suddenly become unfair when applied to the people they paid to make laws. Ocasio-Cortez fought back because retreat had never been the instinct that built her political career, and she shifted immediately toward the record of the Republican majority. She attacked legislation she said had stripped health care from millions, cut school lunches, and delivered tax benefits to billionaires, trying to move the hearing from the question of her productivity to the consequences of her opponent's productivity. It was a familiar and politically useful move because debating the Republican agenda gave her a battlefield on which she knew exactly how to fight, with clear villains, clear victims, and arguments she had delivered many times before. Johnson refused the change of subject with a single interruption and returned the hearing to the narrow question she had been trying to escape. He was not asking whether Republican legislation was good, whether progressive legislation had been blocked, or whether the majority deserved criticism. He was asking how many of her 42 sponsored bills had become law. The Republican majority has blocked progressive legislation at every turn, she began, but Johnson brought the question back before the argument could widen. How many became law? Representative. It returned with the same calm voice, the same patience, and the same refusal to become angry enough to give her a new target, because rage could have been attacked, condescension could have been condemned, and partisanship could have been reframed. Patience was more difficult because patience demanded an answer, and the answer was the one word she had every reason not to say in front of millions of witnesses. Zero spoken aloud by the person whose record was being examined would have transformed a difficult exchange into a permanent clip. So she moved again toward constituent services, advocacy, and oversight. Those defenses were not invented, and they were not meaningless, because members of Congress do far more than sponsor bills, but in the context of the question they sounded increasingly like everything except the requested answer. Johnson listened, nodded, and allowed the explanation to finish, the same way a teacher listens to a student explain every circumstance surrounding an unfinished assignment before returning to whether the assignment itself was actually completed. Then he reached for his own work history, saying that if he had failed to turn in lesson plans for 7 years, he would not have received another round of sympathetic evaluation. He would have been fired, not because he lacked passion for education, not because he failed to speak eloquently about students, but because the people paying him expected the actual work attached to the position. The comparison was deliberately severe, yet its strength came from its simplicity, because almost every taxpayer understands the difference between caring deeply about a job and producing what the job requires. Johnson said the taxpayers of Shreveport had not paid him to be passionate about education. They had paid him to teach, and he had been expected to perform that duty whether anyone applauded or not. In the same way, he argued, the taxpayers of New York's 14th District paid a congressional salary for legislation, and after 7 years, the sponsored bill record still contained no enacted law. That was the dividing line he kept drawing, the difference between saying and doing, between public performance and institutional result, between a show that attracts millions of viewers and a job whose output can be measured after the cameras leave. Her Instagram was a show, her TikTok presence was a show, the Met Gala dress was a show, And Johnson even conceded that these were very effective shows because millions of people watched them. But a show is not a law, and the central accusation was that the district had sent a legislator to Washington only to receive years of content in place of legislation. The room went quiet, not because anyone had suddenly forgotten how to argue, but because the question had finally exposed something that years of political coverage had rarely examined with the same directness. Americans had watched AOC clips, shared them, mocked them, praised them, debated them, and treated them as proof of either courage or incompetence, depending on their politics, yet almost none of that attention had been focused on what those clips had actually produced inside the legislative process. The cycle was familiar. A statement created attention, attention created influence, influence created more coverage, and the coverage created still more attention, while the legal outcome remained detached from the machine generating the fame. Johnson's binder forced the audience to look past the velocity of the content and toward the stillness of the result. Once that contrast became visible, the central question was no longer whether AOC knew how to dominate a hearing, because everyone already knew she did. The question was what domination had delivered. When Ocasio-Cortez answered again, the tone was different because the exchange had moved away from the terrain where her rhetorical speed usually controlled the outcome. She cited bills she had co-sponsored, amendments, letters, caucuses, oversight work, and the broader collection of activities that fill the calendar of a congressional office. Each item had some legitimacy, but together they sounded like an inventory constructed to avoid the one category Johnson had isolated from the beginning. The more the list grew, the more obvious the missing item became, because 42 sponsored bills and 7 years of national prominence still had not produced the answer he had asked for in a single sentence. Johnson did not need another attack, another statistic, or another speech, because, by that point, the silence around the number was doing more damage than any insult could have done. Johnson closed the binder and placed it flat on the table, removed his glasses, folded them carefully, and set them on top with the quiet finality of someone who no longer needed to press the point because the record had already done it for him. There was no victory lap, no raised voice, no attempt to squeeze another viral line out of the moment, only the small, ordinary movements of a man who had finished presenting the evidence and was willing to let everyone else sit with the conclusion. In the hallway, Thomas Vega looked down at his phone and saw the message from the campaign's digital director telling him that the zero number was spreading everywhere and that they needed a response immediately. The problem was that there was no conventional response available because this was not a disputed quote, an anonymous accusation, or a partisan interpretation that could be corrected with better framing. The number had come from the same public congressional record AOC's office was perfectly willing to cite when the numbers worked in her favor, and zero did not become less inconvenient simply because the record had suddenly become politically hostile. Within 72 hours, 2 clips had consumed the political conversation, and the first was the simplest because it required almost no explanation at all. Johnson asked how many of the 42 bills had become law. AOC paused for 9 seconds, declined to give the number, and Johnson asked the question again. That was the entire structure, and that simplicity made the clip far more dangerous than a long partisan monologue, because viewers did not need a commentator to explain what they had just seen. Conservative media treated it as confirmation of everything they already believed. Education commentators treated it as a lesson in accountability, and progressive outlets tried to add the context that Republican obstruction, divided government, committee bottlenecks, and minority party status make it extremely difficult for individual members to pass legislation. Much of that context was technically valid, but none of it altered the arithmetic, because a difficult environment can explain zero without turning 0 into 1. The second clip traveled for a different reason because it was not only about Congress, and that made it immediately recognizable to people who had never cared about legislative procedure. Johnson's distinction between a show and a job became a workplace judgment that could be understood by managers, teachers, business owners, employees, and anyone who had ever watched a colleague become extremely skilled at being seen while someone else quietly completed the actual work. The line about Instagram, TikTok, the Met Gala, and the difference between a performance and a law escaped the political context and entered a much larger argument about visibility and productivity. That was why the clip spread so quickly, because it did not require viewers to know committee rules, congressional calendars, or the history of the Green New Deal in order to understand the accusation. It reduced 7 years of political celebrity to a question familiar in every office in America. After all the meetings, presentations, posts, speeches, appearances, and applause, what exactly got finished? GovTrack's page for Ocasio-Cortez was suddenly flooded with millions of visits as people who had spent years watching the public image finally went looking for the underlying record. The data Johnson had cited was no longer sitting quietly on a website read mostly by political professionals, researchers, staffers, and the occasional obsessive voter, because the hearing had turned a technical scorecard into mass entertainment. Viewers started examining the legislative effectiveness, bills sponsored, committee activity, and bipartisan cooperation with the same intensity they normally reserved for campaign scandals or televised confrontations. The numbers had always been publicly available, but public information is politically irrelevant until someone frames it in a way millions of people can understand. Johnson had done that by replacing ideological warfare with the most basic form of evaluation possible, asking what the job was, what the record showed, and whether the two matched. AOC's office responded by emphasizing constituent services, advocacy, oversight, and the power of a congressional platform to shape the national conversation. Again, none of those defenses were false, and any honest examination of Congress would admit that lawmaking is only one part of what elected representatives actually do. The problem was that the rebuttal still required arguing that the legislative record was not the proper way to measure a legislator, which sounded less like a defense of the record than an argument for looking somewhere else. In almost any other profession, a worker confronted with poor performance in a core responsibility would not be allowed to dismiss the metric simply by pointing to unrelated strengths, no matter how real those strengths might be. Congress, however, has spent decades perfecting the art of treating measurable failure as a messaging problem, and the hearing had exposed just how deeply that habit had become embedded in political culture. The phrase the show began moving through political commentary as a category rather than merely an insult, because the imbalance between fame and legislative output was not unique to one member or one party. Analysts began looking at lawmakers whose social media reach dramatically exceeded their record of enacted legislation, and the resulting comparisons included Republicans as well as Democrats. That broader context mattered, but AOC still dominated the discussion because few members in modern congressional history had achieved anything close to the same scale of celebrity while carrying a legislative record that critics could reduce to such a brutal single number. Millions of followers, national speaking tours, constant television attention, fundraising power, cultural influence, and a global political brand stood on one side of the scale. On the other side, Johnson had placed 42 bills and 0 laws, and the imbalance was so visually obvious that no complicated partisan theory was required to understand why the comparison hurt. Fundraising did not collapse because controversy almost never destroys a modern political fundraising machine and often strengthens it by giving supporters a new enemy to fight. Money continued to arrive, but the character of that money began to matter especially as a larger share came from angry supporters outside the district rather than first-time local donors. That distinction exposed another uncomfortable feature of nationalized politics, because a member of Congress can become so valuable as a national symbol that political survival becomes increasingly disconnected from the daily judgment of the people actually represented. Out-of-state donors were responding to the confrontation as another battle in a national culture war, while local voters had a more immediate reason to ask what 7 years of representation had delivered for them. When political money starts traveling from farther away, the danger is not necessarily financial weakness. The danger is that the politician may be becoming more important to an audience that cannot vote in the district than to the people who can. Elena Vargas, a city council member from Jackson Heights who had launched a primary challenge, understood immediately that Johnson had already given her the argument she needed. Her advertisement did not require expensive production, celebrity endorsements, or an elaborate communication strategy because the strongest material was already sitting in the public record. 42 bills, 0 laws, 7 years, more than $1.2 million in salary, followed by the line that she might not have millions of followers, but would at least turn in her homework. The ad was crude by the standards of professional political media, filmed cheaply and built around numbers rather than cinematic production, but that was exactly why it worked. Vargas did not need to prove that AOC was corrupt, dishonest, unintelligent, or incapable of communicating, because Johnson had offered a much narrower accusation that was easier to understand and harder to dismiss. The most famous person in the classroom had not completed the assignment. The number became politically dangerous because repetition could not weaken it. Every clapback, every Instagram story, every rally, every interview, every photograph, every national tour, and every attempt to widen the conversation eventually returned to the same legislative column. A new speech could create a new headline, but it could not retroactively transform one of those 42 bills into an enacted law. A new viral confrontation could generate another 20 million views, but views were the very metric Johnson had separated from legislative performance in the first place. Once the country had been invited, it reinforcing the accusation rather than escaping it. That to see the difference between attention and output, each additional burst of attention risked reinforcing the accusation rather than escaping it. That was the larger damage done by the hearing because Johnson had not merely scored a partisan point against one congresswoman, he had challenged the system. Was the larger damage done by the hearing because Johnson had not merely scored a partisan point against one congresswoman. He had challenged the system that allowed political celebrity to masquerade indefinitely as political effectiveness. AOC'd indefinitely as political effectiveness. AOC had mastered the modern attention economy better than almost anyone in Congress. And that achievement was real than almost anyone in Congress. And that achievement was real, measurable, and politically powerful. Measurable and politically powerful. But the same machinery that had made her famous, also made the contrast more brutal once someone finally compared the scale of the audience. With the scale of the legislative result. The binder had contained with the scale of the legislative result. The binder had contained no secret document, no hidden scandal, no explosive whistleblower testimony, no secret document, no hidden scandal, no explosive whistleblower testimony, only public information that had been ignored because public attention had been trained to look everywhere else. And once that information was finally placed at the center of the conversation, the argument was no longer about whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could command the center of the conversation, the argument was no longer about whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could command the room, but whether commanding the room had become a substitute for changing the law. That was why the zero would not disappear when the hearing ended, because the number had escaped the room and attached itself to the larger argument about what members of Congress are actually paid to do. The defenders of Ocasio-Cortez could point to constituent casework, media influence, ideological leadership, fundraising, organizing power, and the ability to move national debate, and all of those arguments had substance. But none of them erased the narrower question Johnson had asked. And the more aggressively supporters insisted that legislation was only one part of the job, the more critics asked why the most obvious legislative measure had to be pushed aside at all. A member of Congress can be influential without passing laws, just as a public figure can shape culture without holding office, but Johnson's point was that congressional fame should not automatically be accepted as evidence of congressional effectiveness. Once that distinction was made publicly, AOC's greatest political asset, visibility, suddenly became the backdrop against which the lack of enacted legislation looked even more severe. The hearing also exposed the strange incentives of modern politics, where the activities most likely to generate attention are often the activities least connected to the slow, frustrating, deeply unglamorous process of writing law. Committee negotiations do not usually produce viral clips. Bipartisan amendments rarely trend for days, and the technical work of moving language through a chamber has none of the immediate emotional payoff of a confrontation that can be cut into 30 seconds and uploaded before the hearing even ends. The modern political system rewards the member who can dominate a news cycle far more visibly than the member who quietly negotiates language that eventually becomes law. AOC had become exceptionally skilled at the first task, and the entire media ecosystem had rewarded that skill with an audience most lawmakers could never imagine building. Johnson's attack worked because he forced that ecosystem to confront the possibility that it had been measuring the wrong thing for years. The irony was difficult to miss because the same attention machine that had elevated AOC now amplified the argument against her with brutal efficiency. The clip of her silence traveled through the exact platforms she had mastered, stripped of the long explanations and context that usually protected a politician from a single damaging moment. Millions of viewers did not watch a seminar on congressional procedure. They watched a question, a pause, and a refusal to say the number. Every attempt to explain the difficulty of passing legislation required far more words than the clip itself. And politics has never been kind to explanations that need 5 paragraphs to compete with 9 seconds of silence. Johnson had discovered the same rule AOC had used against opponents for years, that a simple visual contradiction can overpower an entire page of context. The broader lesson was not that every member who fails to pass a sponsored bill is automatically useless, because Congress is too complicated for that kind of childish measurement. The lesson was that a politician who builds an entire public identity around effectiveness, urgency, courage, and action should expect someone eventually to compare the scale of the branding with the scale of the institutional result. AOC had spent years speaking as though Washington suffered primarily from a lack of moral clarity and political will, and Johnson's binder turned the examination back toward her own ability to convert those convictions into enacted law. That was the trap, because she could not easily argue that the system made legislation impossible without weakening years of rhetoric suggesting that stronger leadership and greater courage could overcome the system. The record, therefore, became more than a scorecard. It became a test of whether the standards she applied to institutions and opponents could survive being applied to herself. Johnson's use of the teacher analogy made the attack even harder to dismiss because it translated congressional performance into the language of ordinary accountability. most Americans will never sponsor a bill, negotiate committee language, or understand every procedural obstacle between introduction and enactment. But almost everyone understands the concept of an assignment that was never completed. They understand the employee who gives an impressive presentation but misses the deadline, the student who dominates discussion but fails to submit the work, and the manager who confuses visibility with production. By placing AOC inside that familiar frame, Johnson removed the protective complexity that usually surrounds congressional records. He turned legislative failure from an abstract institutional problem into something that sounded like a performance review. That did not mean the comparison was perfectly fair, and even many of Johnson's critics could identify the weaknesses in reducing legislative effectiveness to the number of sponsored bills signed into law. Members influence legislation through amendments, co-sponsorship, negotiations, committee pressure, oversight, coalition building, and language that may appear inside someone else's bill. But the hearing was not designed as a graduate seminar on congressional productivity, and political damage is rarely determined by whether the most sophisticated interpretation is available. It is determined by whether the central accusation feels clear enough to survive contact with the public. 42 bills and 0 laws was clear, and once the number became the shorthand for 7 years in office, every technical qualification sounded like an attempt to negotiate with the scoreboard after the game had ended. The most damaging element was therefore not the accusation itself, but the inability to replace it with an equally simple counter-argument. AOC could not point to one sponsored bill and say that it had become law, because within the record used in the script, that example did not exist. She could expand the definition of effectiveness, and she did, but expansion was exactly what Johnson's narrow framing made look evasive. He had reduced the hearing to one measurable category, and every attempt to discuss another category allowed him to return to the same question with even more force. In a political culture built on speed, the side that can explain its argument in one sentence usually defeats the side that needs an essay. The final political danger was that the argument could be copied by anyone. A primary challenger did not need privileged documents, insider testimony, or millions of dollars in opposition research because the material was already public and the language had already been tested in front of a national audience. 42 bills, 0 laws, 7 years, more than $1.2 million in salary became an attack structure that could fit inside a television advertisement, a mailer, a debate question, or a social media post. Once an opponent can compress an entire critique of a congressional career into 4 numbers, the burden shifts to the incumbent to complicate the story, and complication is rarely the stronger position in a campaign. Johnson had not merely criticized AOC, he had handed future opponents a ready-made frame. The deeper indictment extended beyond her because Congress is full of members from both parties who have learned that outrage is more marketable than legislation and performance, more visible than process. They appear on television, build personal brands, raise money from national audiences, attack the other side, release clips, and return the next day to repeat the cycle. Some of them pass laws, some of them do not, but the system rewards the appearance of constant action even when the institutional record remains thin. Johnson's binder mattered because it suggested a different form of accountability, one based not on how often a politician appears to be fighting, but on what remains after the fight is over. That standard would make many members of Congress uncomfortable, which is exactly why the argument traveled far beyond one hearing. For AOC, the problem was that the 0 now sat beside every future performance. The next viral speech could still go viral, the next confrontation could still generate millions of views, and the next tour could still fill rooms. But critics now had a number ready to place underneath the applause. Fame had once protected the record by distracting from it. After Johnson's question, Fame magnified the contrast. The larger the audience became, the more people could be reminded that extraordinary influence had not, according to the record presented in the hearing, produced a sponsored law. That is why the number remained powerful after the cameras moved on, because it had become not merely a statistic, but a verdict on the distance between political visibility and political output. In the end, Johnson did not need a scandal, a hidden recording, a leaked email, or a dramatic accusation because the public record was enough. He opened a binder, separated communication from legislation, compared national fame with legislative output, and asked one question that the most practiced communicator in the room could not answer with a number she was willing to say aloud. The hearing became a reminder that politics can hide poor results behind noise for a very long time, but noise loses its protective power the moment someone turns down the volume and reads the score. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had spent 7 years proving that she could command attention better than almost anyone in Congress, and Mike Johnson's argument was that attention was never supposed to be the final product. The binder closed, the clips kept spreading, and the number stayed exactly where it had been from the beginning: 0.